The creative team behind Batman the Animated Series is famed for their work revitalizing Batman's foes, stripping back decades of accumulated nonsense and distilling the villains into their purest forms. We've discussed this at length in my other videos, but there's one villain that started out as a pretty vanilla copy of his comic book counterpart, but over time he became something far more sinister, and that character is the Scarecrow. Before we look at how he was implemented in the show, let's take a look at his comic book origins. First appearing in 1941's World's Finest 3, we're introduced to Professor Jonathan Crane, a teacher of psychology who specialised in the study of fear. Crane was widely mocked by his peers for his unusual looks, shabby clothes, and love of old books. During one of his lectures on fear, Crane discusses the gangster's protection racket, intimidating people in exchange for cash, and the cogs in his mind begin to turn. With his expert knowledge of fear, he could start his own protection racket to get respect, power, and money to buy more books. Leaning into the insults thrown his way, Crane decides to adopt the identity of the Scarecrow and start a campaign of fear and intimidation. Aside from the costume, the initial version of the Scarecrow bore little resemblance to the villain we know today. His methods of causing fear tended to involve jumping out at people and shooting them. It was a simpler time, I guess. The Scarecrow's ability to artificially induce fear wasn't introduced until the 1960s, although it took various forms over the decades. A chemical spray, a mechanical skull that radiated a fear wave, and the more widely known fear gas, sometimes distributed through the snapping of a straw. When it came time for the character to make his way to BTAS, it seems like the show's creators decided that if it wasn't broke, then it didn't need fixing. Sure, they made some changes. They simplified his fear toxin delivery method to just being a gas or powder, but he was mostly unchanged from the comics, making him one of the most authentic to the comics villains in the show. The only slight change they made is that he was now driven by a desire for revenge rather than greed.
Take what you can, then burn the rest. Burn it, boss? This isn't about money. It's about revenge.
Yes, he is stealing money from the university, but only to force them into bankruptcy. In later episodes, the Scarecrow would commit crimes to fund his experiments. After all,
you know the cost of chemicals these days.
While both the comic and animated series version of the character were fired from their position due to their unethical experiments in fear, the comic book version of the character is quite accepting of this rejection and takes it as a sign that he should dedicate himself to a full-time career as the Scarecrow. BTAS's version of the Scarecrow has little interest in money. Instead, he's motivated by an obsession with studying fear. For what purposes? It's never really said. Now, I know that I said that at first glance the creative team didn't deviate from the comic book version of the Scarecrow very much, and that is true when it comes to Batman the Animated Series. However, things were really shaken up when Batman the Animated Series became The New Batman Adventures. When TNBA launched, almost every character went through a fairly radical redesign to match the simplified, more anime-inspired art style, but no one went through a more radical transformation than the Scarecrow. Perhaps the creative team realised that they had missed an opportunity to put their own stamp on the character, as they had with so many other villains, and as such they completely changed several aspects of the Scarecrow. Now, the Scarecrow does have the distinction of being the only character to be redesigned twice through the course of BTAS and TNBA. There are three distinct phases, which I call Baghead, Pumpkinhead, and Zombie. The original Baghead look from Nothing to Fear strongly resembles his look from the comic books, but it isn't particularly frightening. You can't really get a wide range of expressions in that mask, which is likely one of the reasons why Crane unmasked towards the end of the episode. Imagine this scene playing out with the expressionless mask being worn instead. It wouldn't be anywhere near as effective. In response to this, the Scarecrow's second phase, Pumpkinhead, was introduced in Fear of Victory. This new mask allowed a greater variety of expressions and at times could look quite freaky, but it still wasn't that frightening. Minor adjustments were made to this mask over time, mainly to the straw hair and the shape of the face. But overall, the mask remained the same for the rest of that initial series. It's worth noting that while the design changed, his characterization remained entirely the same throughout the entirety of BTAS. Now, it wasn't until The New Batman Adventures that the Scarecrow was given a truly frightening look. His new mask was less expressive, true, but it resembled rotting flesh with jagged teeth. A cut noose sits around his neck and his long gangly arms are exposed with pale grey looking flesh. He basically looks like a reanimated corpse. Similarly, his characterization changed. Gone were Henry Pollock's transatlantic accent and multisyllabic speeches.
I am the master of fear, the lord of despair. Cower before me in witless terror.
Hi, Professor Crane.
Good evening, child.
Worship me, fools. Worship me.
Instead, we were presented with Jeffrey Combs' soft, menacing whisper.
Fear is power. And today it will also be quite expensive if you want the antidote.
This dramatic change in appearance was never really explained in the show, but it was explored in some of the tie-in comics. The Batman Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles Adventures comic explains Scarecrow's radical transformation as being a response to an encounter with the Krang. So traumatized was he by his time in Dimension X that Scarecrow decided he needed to be scarier than ever. Now, your mileage may vary, but I don't like this explanation very much. The Master of Fear, intimidated by some wobbly brain creatures from another dimension? Nah. I think there are far better explanations out there. Take, for instance, The Legacies of the DCAU, an unofficial fan-made webcomic that provides a potential origin for the Scarecrow's new look. In their story, Scary Things, they put forward the idea that the Scarecrow committed suicide while incarcerated and was resurrected as an agent of Hades. It's pretty grim and you can see why. They'd never touch that in a kids' show. But I think it's quite a valid idea. A more official version of the origin comes to us via Batman Adventures writer and artist Ty Templeton, who explained to Comic Book Resources that Jonathan Crane had been found guilty of murder and sentenced to death by hanging, only for the rope to snap. Crane now believes himself to be deceased, some sort of zombie, and his new look was designed to match his demeanour. We get a very brief glimpse of Crane outside of his new costume in Batman Adventures Volume 2, Number 1, and we can see that there's definitely something wrong with him physically. I mean, just look at that word balloon. Now, the canonicity of tie-in comic books is uneven at best. There are multiple events in these comics that directly contradict the events of the show. Hello, Mullet Superman. But some of these tie-in comics are considered canon, like the time Batman teamed up with Etrigan to stop Ra's al Ghul from summoning a demon of his own. So take this origin with a pinch of salt, especially because it was never even published. The thing that I think is really cool about this design, however, is that it harkens back to foes seen in one of Batman's earliest appearances, Hugo Strange's Monster Men from 1940's Batman No. 1. These abominations were human beings forever warped by Strange's experiments into hulking, mindless brutes, and Batman dealt with them in a particularly gruesome way. One specific Monster Man was hung by Batman from the Batplane and dumped from a great height. See the similarity to Scarecrow's new costume? They're practically the same. I enjoy callbacks like this, even if the Monster Men and Scarecrow are completely unrelated. At least, as far as we know. The fact that this new look was never given an official origin story has led to an array of potential backstories being discussed by fans and creators alike. He's almost become a mythical boogeyman, in that we're never sure if he's alive, dead, or even the same person that we saw in BTAS. For all we know, there could be more than one Scarecrow out there, and that's the beauty of this design.